In hushed silence, Günter, Wetzel, and Peter Strelzyk pulled yard after yard of folded fabric from the back of a car and assembled their contraption by starlight. It was a midnight escape so risky it seemed destined to fail. They'd already had once before, but this time was different. Nervous glances at the woods betrayed their worry. The East German secret police knew about their plan and would be out searching. Soon, an air blower roared to life. A round, swollen giant grew in the shadows, and a 40-foot-high burst of flame lit the clearing. Wetzel and Strelzyk guided their wives and children onto the metal platform. Gripping tight to a rail made of clothesline, the only barrier between them and freefall, the two families rose toward the clouds under a patchwork ball of fire, a 75-foot-tall hand-sewn hot air balloon. Battered by winds, the balloon climbed higher, more than a mile into the sky, until the homemade burner gave one last choked sputter and died. Just before 2:30 a.m., September 15, 1979, two terrified families began plummeting towards the pitch-black ground. What happened next is the stuff of legend, as are the rest of these incredible true stories of desperate people who risked everything for freedom during the Cold War. Václav Ulick Sr. was a man who was fed up with living under totalitarianism. He had been sent to concentration camps twice during World War II, so to say it was time for something new is an understatement. Unfortunately, authoritarian rule wasn't done with him. A coup in 1948 brought a communist government to power in Ulick's native Czechoslovakia. That's when Ulick decided not just to slip out of the Iron Curtain, but to blow a hole right through it. His target? The border fence, parallel rows of concrete pylons and razor wire with landmines in between each row, and armed guards on patrol. West Germany was on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and that was the goal. The consequences of failure? Capture and execution. It was all or nothing. An auto mechanic by trade, Ulick found work delivering timbers to the very fence he intended to break through. He traded his truck for an old German armored vehicle to haul logs. With heavy plating and treads, it was already tank-like, so Ulick set to work taking it the rest of the way there. It took Ulick 5 years to reinforce the vehicle with scavenged material, working deep into the night to avoid arousing suspicion. He would go out drinking with the guys who manned and maintained the border fence, listening closely for details about where the fence was weakest and where the mines were buried. The plan had to be perfect. His wife and 2 children would be escaping with him, along with several friends, and he knew what the stakes were if he got caught. Early on July 25, 1953, Ulick loaded everyone into his homemade tank, 8 of them in all, and began his white-knuckle dash for freedom. He pinpointed a marshy area of the border where heavier obstacles tended to sink, so the fence was mainly wire to make his escape. The tension in the tank must have been unbearable, but it was released in an instant. To Ulick and his family, the siren song of freedom sounded a little something like this. The tank ripped through 3 rows of fence so fast that the stunned border guards never even had time to fire. On the other side was political asylum in West Germany, then a new life in the US for Ulick and his family. Now, if you can't make a tank to blow your way out of an oppressive situation, the next best option is stealing one. The division of Germany during the Cold War meant that most of the city of Berlin existed as an island of West Germany surrounded by the East. So many people moved to West Berlin after the country's division that in 1961, East Germany built the notorious Berlin Wall, sealing the free side off from any East Germans. One of the men who had built the Berlin Wall wasn't very happy about how that had worked out. One day in April 1963, East German soldier Wolfgang Engels helped himself to a Soviet-made armored personnel carrier. But he was a generous escapee. Before making his dash for freedom, he drove the APC through the streets of East Germany and asked a group of strangers if they wanted to go with him. Believe it or not, nobody took him up on his offer, and they missed the opportunity of a lifetime. Once they turned him down, he pointed his ride right at the Berlin Wall, gunned it, and drove right through it. Well, most of the way through. The vehicle got stuck, and Engels was shot twice by East German guards when he climbed out and got caught in a roll of razor wire. Just when all seemed lost, a West German policeman opened fire on the East German guards, and in the chaos, several Berliners carried Engels' unconscious body into a nearby bar. A little while later, he became possibly the happiest person in history to wake up in a strange bar with gunshot wounds. When he regained consciousness, he noticed that the liquor bottles in the bar had West German labels. He'd made it. He recovered and even lived to see the Berlin Wall fall in 1989.
A Hungarian airliner stands on a NATO airstrip in West Germany at the end of a daring flight to freedom across the Iron Curtain.
So what was the first recorded airplane hijacking? Now, history is fuzzy, but while Hungarian brickmaker Frank Isaac's plan to commandeer an airplane and fly it to the west might not have been the very first, certainly close. And it's definitely one of the few times where it's easy to root for the hijackers. Isaac had been looking for a way through the Iron Curtain for some time. He was a writer who was forced into manual labor at a brick factory under the oppressive communist regime in Hungary, and day after day he imagined ways to escape his dismal life. While talking to a friend, he came up with his scheme to take over a plane and soar over the Alps to a better life. Isaac, his wife, and a group of friends that included a former fighter pilot boarded a small commercial flight in Budapest on July 13, 1956. They didn't know if they'd ever leave the plane alive, but they knew that one way or another, they wouldn't set foot on Hungarian soil again. Armed with wrenches, they broke into the cockpit and got their first surprise, a secret policeman who immediately tried to shoot them. They overpowered him, took control of the plane, and got a second surprise. The door was jammed open, which meant they couldn't rise higher than 10,000 feet. Now, this is a terrible thing to realize when you're rocketing through mountain peaks that rise as high as 11,000 feet. They were flying blind, jetting through a soup of thick clouds that blanketed the windshield, with mountain crags whizzing by the open door. When the fuel began to run out, they had no choice but to bring the plane down out of the clouds, not knowing if a mountain would loom up directly in front of them. Instead, they found themselves miraculously directly in front of an airstrip at a NATO airbase in West Germany. Back in Hungary, Isaac and his conspirators were given a trial in absentia and sentenced to death. Not that it mattered, they never went back. They were given political asylum and moved to the US. Isaac later wrote a book about the harrowing escape before he passed away in 2018. So, as we mentioned earlier, Germans couldn't move freely between the halves of Berlin, but foreigners could, which is how Austrian citizen and West Berlin resident Heinz Meixner met East German Marguerite Thoreau at a dance. Smitten by young love, they decided to get married, but there was a hitch in the hitchin'. Meixner would have to move to East Berlin with Thoreau rather than the other way around. Unimpressed with that plan, Meixner came up with a better one. He knew from his visits that the border crossing used a metal barrier that was raised to allow cars to pass once they'd been vetted by border guards. Once a car passed, the bar was lowered to block the next car in line, but it didn't lower all the way down. At its lowest, there was a 37.5-inch gap between the bottom of the barrier and the pavement. So Meixner rented an Austin Healey Sprite, a compact sports car with a windshield clearance of 48 inches. If someone was so inclined to take that windshield off, however, the Sprite's hood reached a mere 35.5 inches, 2 inches shorter than the barrier. Meixner's plan was daringly simple, providing he was good at math. In May 1963, Thoreau lay down in the cramped back seat. Her mother folded herself into the trunk. Meixner unbolted the windshield and cruised towards the border crossing. When Meixner got to the head of the line, he was told to drive off to the side for a full search. Instead, he ducked and gunned the engine. The Sprite zipped under the security bar with mere inches to spare, and Meixner and the ladies skidded into West Berlin with panache. It worked so well that 2 months later, an Argentinian used not only the same plan, but poetically the very same rental car to sprint his own fiancée into West Germany. After that, the barriers were modified to prevent anyone else from limboing to freedom. Now, you couldn't go through the Berlin Wall, and it was designed to be pretty hard to go over. More on that in a bit. But under? Well, that might just work. A 21-year-old student named Joachim Nyman got out in 1961, not through a harrowing tunnel escape, but by borrowing the passport of a Swiss friend. But even with an easier life in front of him, Nyman decided he wasn't finished with East Germany. Along with a group of fellow students, he returned to the wall in hopes of helping other people get out too. Using a derelict bakery on the western side as a home base, they started digging. With shovels and buckets and flour sacks full of excavated dirt, the men bent to the grueling work for months, tunneling over 30 feet deep, under the wall, under the perimeter alarms, and under the barren no-man's land lorded over by armed guards and searchlights.
Dozens of people worked on the tunnel. Most of them had family and friends on the other side.
They sent word to those very family and friends and gave the address for the tunnel entrance. After 5 months, Nyman and his mole men emerged in the east, in an outhouse, as chance would have it. You can make your own joke there, but that's as good a place as any because people do need to go in there. On the night of October 3rd, 1964, the unassuming people casually strolled down the street under the watchful eyes of the guards across the road. In ones and twos, they stepped into a building, whispered the password, and squeezed into the tunnel. The next night, the clandestine operation resumed. Nyman's girlfriend managed to escape, but eventually the guards got suspicious of the number of pedestrians who seemed to keep vanishing and went to check it out. One of the lookouts sent back a warning, and everyone already in the tunnel made it to safety before the escape route was destroyed. But it served its purpose. In those 2 nights, 57 people crawled right under the noses of the guards on the Berlin Wall, making up approximately a fifth of everyone who ever tunneled out in a 30-year span. Bernd Becker was born with a mechanical mind, which brought him to the attention of East German authorities early in life. As a teenager, Becker built a homemade rocket that landed in the courtyard of the local police station. Though he wasn't directly punished, the Stasi were watching him, later forcing him out of a college engineering program. They were suspicious that he'd end up figuring out how to fly over the border. Becker instead figured out how to go around it. He built a gasoline-powered waterproof engine that could pull him for long distances underwater. He called it the Aqua Scooter. On September 8, 1968, Becker headed back to the Baltic coast wearing a wetsuit and carrying a little bit of deflated air mattress, which he could inflate and use as a workspace if the Aqua Scooter needed repairs at sea. Facing an endless horizon of dark waves, he took a deep breath, waded into the water, and headed for Sweden or Denmark. He knew the risks. Multiple people had tried to swim out of Germany only to be shot by patrols. His journey took about 6 hours. At one point, he had to wait underwater while an East German patrol boat passed directly over him. But finally, Becker came across a Danish Coast Guard vessel that pulled him up and deposited him in Lübeck, West Germany. In all, he traveled about 15 miles or so with his Aqua Scooter. So let's go back to that first story. We pick up the action in the early morning hours of September 15, 1979. A night watchman in the town of Bad Lobenstein looked up and saw an unidentified glowing object hovering in the skies above. He didn't know it at the time, but he just caught sight of Günter Wetzel, Peter Strelzyk, and their families madly drifting for freedom in their homemade hot air balloon. Now, Günter originally got this idea when he saw a magazine photo of the annual Hot Air Balloon Festival held in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He thought that just maybe he could make his own balloon to get his family and friends out of East Germany. How hard could it be? Now, they knew nothing about balloons, but Wetzel and his fellow would-be balloonist Strelzyk secretly got to work, guessing and experimenting the whole way. Peter sewed the balloons on his mother-in-law's pedal-powered sewing machine, while Günter's interest in physics and engineering helped them troubleshoot and refine the design. The first one didn't work at all. The second one was too small and, worse, crashed in its test flight and was found by authorities. The police put out notices asking for information about anyone who might be secretly building balloons. With the heat on, Günter and Peter frantically worked on finishing the third balloon and got it ready just in time. The group lifted off in the small hours of the morning, but the flight was harrowing from the start. The balloon tilted when they lifted off, and the burners scorched the fabric. Then one of the seams opened a hole in the top, forcing them to use more gas than they'd intended to keep the balloon inflated. But it carried them off the ground erratically, unpredictably. Winds dictated their course. West German radar picked up their flight, while back east, searchlights hunted the sky for their patchwork airship. After a nail-biting 23-minute flight, the burner ran out of fuel. The balloon sank from over a mile up and punched the ground with so much force that Wetzel's leg broke from the impact. They were alive, but where? They ran from the wreckage until they were picked up by West German police and could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Against all odds, that plan had actually worked. At the age of 14, Liliana Gasinskaya decided she wanted to leave the USSR. She worked her way through school with that thought in mind, learning the ins and outs of the tourism service before eventually securing a job as a waitress on the SS Leonid Sobanov, a ship that sailed from the Odessa port on the Black Sea. She taught herself fragments of broken English so that when she made a break for it, she'd be able to request asylum. On January 15, 1979, she got her shot. As the ship approached Australia, she put on a red bikini, wiggled through a porthole, and dove into the sea. After swimming for about 40 minutes, Liliana waded ashore in Sydney Harbor. Thanks to her choice of swimwear, she became known as the Red Bikini Girl. A pretty young woman with an amazing story, Gasinskaya quickly made headlines and controversy. Immigration and asylum for refugees was a hot-button topic on Australia at the time, and Gasinskaya's dramatic arrival sparked an eruption of legal debates about whether she should be deported.
No, I don't think we're obliged to take many of them at all. Not in the numbers that they're professing to want to take into the country.
In the end, she was allowed to stay in Australia and marry. She even posed for a magazine, without her famous red bikini on. We're not going to show that photo here, sorry. Now, escaping in an airplane was probably a given for Ivo Zdarsky. He'd been building and flying hang gliders since he was a teenager, and bolting a motor onto one was the next logical step. If anything, his 3 a.m. escape from Czechoslovakia sounds more fun than anything. He put together what amounted to a tricycle with wings, mounted a small car engine on it, and designed the propeller himself. On August 4, 1984, Zdarsky lifted off from a field in what is now present-day Slovakia. He purposely flew directly over a Czech radar station to take advantage of its blind spot, then puttered right past the Morava River that marked the border and into Austrian airspace. That was it. He was out. In fact, he was having so much fun that he made a few loops over Vienna to enjoy the view before touching down behind a 747 on one of the runways at the Vienna International Airport, one of the largest airports in the region. At that time of night, there was almost nobody around, but Zdarsky showed his passport to a flustered mechanic who ran out to see what was going on and received political asylum. From Vienna, he moved to the US and started a company making propellers. He's still flying homemade aircraft to this day. People couldn't cross the border between Czechoslovakia and Austria freely, but electricity? Well, that was a different story. High-tension electrical wires brought 380,000 volts of electricity from a nuclear power plant in southern Czechoslovakia to users in Austria. But Franz Daniel Pohl and Robert Oswald decided they'd hitch a ride, using homemade seats to construct the wires into ziplines that would, if all went well, whiz them right into Austria. They spent 2 days hiding out in a cornfield near the border, waiting for a thunderstorm so that the border guards would have a harder time seeing and hearing them during the escape. The storm came on the very early morning of July 19, 1986. They climbed up onto one of the pylons, attached their seats to the topmost wires, and wished each other luck. Momentum wasn't enough to carry them all the way from pylon to pylon, so they had to arduously pull themselves hand over hand along the wire. After 4 hours of hushed scooching through the thunderstorm, high above the ground on power lines that could fry them in an instant, they reached the Austrian border and a new life for both of them.